So we're delighted to introduce our speaker this evening, Dr Turpie, lecturer in history at the University of Stirling and tutor at the University of the Highlands and Islands. Tom will be telling us about his research into the beautiful parish churches of medieval Scotland, which largely survived the Reformation intact. Tom will provide a quick background on the evolving function of parish and borough churches between the 12th and 19th centuries, and how they became a real central hub for all sorts of purposes, not just religious worship. Tom's main focus, however, will be in providing a how-to guide for researching the history of these buildings and the communities they served, from the most useful reference works and primary source databases, to the Kirk Session and Burgh records found in the National Records of Scotland and local archive centres. So it's over to you, Tom. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Jessica. Well, good evening to you all. And well, I think as I see so many people logged on here from North America too, so good morning, I suspect, to many of you, or early afternoon, perhaps. So as Jess says, my name is Tom, and I've spent much of the last 15 years exploring the religious history of medieval Scotland, and most recently on two projects, the Corpus of Medieval Parish Churches and the Sacred Landscapes of Fife. So why parish churches in particular, might you ask? Well, as a historian, I'm always keen to try and get beyond the traditional stories that have dominated the scholarship on, particularly on medieval Scotland, all that stuff about kings and queens, to get more of a sense of what life was like for the wider population. So I've tended to be drawn to the less big, gaudy cathedrals and monasteries, and more to the smaller, everyday churches that would have been at the centre of the life of most ordinary people. And there's also the added bonus that, unlike most of Scotland's cathedrals and monasteries, parish churches, of which there are roughly about 1,000 in the Middle Ages, largely survived the Reformation intact and continue to play a role in their local communities, often right up to the present day. But before we get started properly, just a quick word on terminology here. So I'll be using the word borough church and parish church fairly interchangeably. So for much of the period I'm going to cover, most Scottish towns only had one parish church. Edinburgh was a bit unusual in having two, in St Giles and St Cuthbert's. So in most towns like Stirling or Linlithgow, there was only one parish church. So a borough church is just the name for a parish church in an urban setting. I'm also going to have lots of information on the slides, a few links to useful websites, things like that. Don't worry too much about getting any of that written down. As Jessica's indicated, the talk will be recorded, and I'm also happy to share my slides with anyone at all who would like any of the information from them. But I'm going to begin this evening with a nice example from Fife. And a bit of a disclaimer here, lots of my examples today will come from Fife because that's where I've been working on most recently. This is St Serph's Church in Dysart. St Serph's first appears in the documentary record about 1220, although it's clear that there had been a church there for some time before that. In the 15th century, it was greatly expanded into a large and impressive structure, including this 8-storey tower and porch. It had quite an unusual martial appearance for a church, with shot holes in the two lowest stories on the south side, and it may well have been part of the coastal defences on the north side of the Forth. The church and its high altar were dedicated to St Serph, and there were several further altars in the church dedicated to Saints James and Mary, and probably most interesting, Magnus of Kirkwall. After the Reformation, the congregation only used part of the nave of the medieval church, abandoning the aisles and the chancel. And part of the chancel was separated from the rest of the church and became the burial place of the Sinclair family, the main local landowners. And the Sinclair family had moved to Fife from Orkney. They'd been given lands in in and around Dysart in the 14th century, and that was why we find an altar dedicated to St Magnus in that church. And in about 1802, so 1803, the congregation moved to a new parish church in an event known locally as the Big Flitting. The old parish church was abandoned, and apart from the Sinclair burial aisle, it was which was itself reconstructed with a new roof so it could be used as a mausoleum for the Earls of Roslin. Since then, the church has been repaired on a number of occasions, first in the 1890s and more recently by the Dysart Trust. The tower is still accessible and it's opened a few times a year on things like Doors Open Day, and it gives very impressive views of the Forth. I just seen a couple of questions coming up there. This was a Catholic church up until 1560, and after that, a Church of Scotland Protestant church. So it began life very much as a Catholic church, and then was transformed in 1560, and we'll come back to that a bit later. So what we have here is a church that was in use for at least 600 years, and one that's still a very important part of the local town's heritage, and it still dominates the skyline. Any of you that have been to Dysart see that it really dominates the town. Now, I've carried out research on the church twice on different projects, and it involved using quite a number of different sources. So here is my bibliography, as all good historians should. I'm showing you my sources, something I've been trying to drum into my first year students at Stirling over the last month or so. So firstly, manuscript sources. So original documents found mostly in archives. And as you can see, the ones I used were mainly from the 16th and 17th centuries, mostly church records, in this case, Kirk Session, presbytery records, that sort of thing, and one testament at the bottom there. I also use quite a number of what we call printed primary sources. So primary sources that have been edited and sometimes translated or transcribed by people generally in the 19th and 20th centuries and included in printed volumes. So stuff like Vatican records here, you can see entries from the papal registers. We go on to the next page, right up the end here, we've got some monastic charters, local records compiled by a local historian, and then more recently into the 18th century, the statistical accounts, which we'll talk about later. I also used some secondary sources, so work written by other people. Patricia Denison's work on medieval boroughs, she's very good on that sort of thing. A really good local history book by Carol McNeil and Jim Swan, and a book, one of my own books as well, because I'd explored this subject before. And finally, some websites and databases. So in this case, mostly online materials that came from university research projects. So we have the corpus of Scottish medieval parish churches, and some work from local NGOs. So I was trying to find out more about what's happening with the church now. So Dysart is a roughly middle-sized parish church in terms of surviving course materials from medieval Scotland. If you were researching a small rural church in Argyll, there will be a lot fewer sources. If you were looking at the Church of St Giles here in Edinburgh, there would be a lot more. But this just gives you a sense of what's involved in carrying out research on a single church. And I'll refer back to some of these specific source types as we go on. So what I'm going to do with the remaining 25 minutes or so, half an hour, is give you a bit of background on the purpose and function of parish churches and point you towards some key periods of change in their development. I'll then spend the rest of the talk giving you a bit of a guide on where to start and where to find key sources for exploring the history of these buildings and the communities they serve, from useful reference works and primary source databases to the Kirk Session and Burgh records that you can find somewhere like the National Records of Scotland. So if you do have any particular questions as you go along, as Jess indicated, you can pop them in the Q&A section or in the chat, or save them for the end and we can deal with them then. So firstly, just a little bit of background. So what was a medieval parish? Well, a medieval parish was a designated territory centred on a stone-built church and ministered by one priest. They were distinguished from other places of worship, like chapels, for example, by the possession of a baptismal font, like this beautiful one that survived from Inverkeithing here. It dates from about 1400. And the legal requirement that all the inhabitants of a given area were to bring their children to that church for baptism, to get married, and to practice communion at least once a year. In the Middle Ages and well into the early modern period, so the sort of 15th century up to the 18th century, their function was both spiritual and financial. So the role of the parish priest and later the minister was to bring the church's teachings to the people and to help ensure their salvation. However, parishes were also financial hubs. It was a place where the tithe, known in Scotland as a tynd, could be collected. So tithes were a 10% tax, annual tax on produce liable to all parishioners to their local church. The money was intended to pay for the upkeep of the parish church. It could support a well-trained priest to minister to the population, and it financed the administration of the church more widely, paying for church bureaucracy and buildings such as cathedrals. In the Middle Ages, a group of parishes was formed into a diocese, each run by a bishop, and a group of dioceses formed an archdiocese, run by an archbishop, who then reported directly to the Pope. After the Reformation, the parish system was retained largely as it was, with the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland running the institution at a national level, and the diocese replaced by new regional administrative units like the Synod and presbyteries. Below them remained parish, with its minister and council of elders from the local lay community, and that was probably the key difference between the Middle Ages and the post-Reformation period, that involvement of local lay people. So parishes were a vital financial and administrative building block of the medieval and early modern church structure, and they remained important organisational units for civil government well into the 20th century. And their churches were very much more than just religious buildings. As more often than not, the largest building in any community, they could serve as community centres, as courts, as banks for the local people, and other functions that we now see taken by civil government. Their towers were used as watchtowers for local defence, and in coastal areas, many of them, such as the one at Dysart, were used as lighthouses and markers for shipping. Now, there were three key periods in which construction took place at these churches. There were three what might call key periods in the development of the parish church in medieval Scotland. The first of these was in the 12th and 13th centuries, and that's when we get the first stone parish churches in Scotland. Some of these were entirely new, but most were probably built on the site of older wooden structures. And three particularly fine surviving examples are on the slide here. So we have Lucas and Markinch and Fife and Dalmeny in Mid Lothian. If you want to go and see a nice 12th century parish church, and you're anywhere near Fife or Midlothian, those are the ones to go and have a look at. The next key period of construction was the late 14th century up to the Reformation, and this was a real major period of church building, particularly in Scotland's towns and larger villages. New churches were built in places like St Andrews and Cooper, and in towns like Linlithgow, Edinburgh, Stirling, Perth, Dundee and Aberdeen, the existing church was greatly expanded, creating the significant buildings that we see today in all those locations. The Reformation saw some changes to the fabric of these buildings, particularly the furnishings. And some of the larger churches like St Nicholas's in Aberdeen, which is a huge, huge church, St Giles in Edinburgh and St Michael's in Linlithgow, which we have on the slide here. Some of these were deemed to be too large for the congregations, and sometimes parts of the church were blocked off. On one or two occasions, walls were built down the middle of these churches to split them into two churches. But in general, most of the parish churches in Scotland fared rather better at the Reformation than the monasteries and cathedrals. And that was because they were still needed. They were still a vital part of the new form of religious practice that took over from 1560. Now, the 17th and 18th centuries saw the abandonment and occasional relocation of a church. Sometimes if the population centre of a parish had changed significantly, they would move the church. But generally, that was quite rare. And that period mostly saw the patching up of old buildings, much to the chagrin of lots of ministers who, as we'll see a bit later, spent a lot of time complaining about having to preach in drafty old medieval churches. The next key period of change was the late 18th and 19th centuries. Across Scotland in that period, parish churches were demolished or largely rebuilt in large numbers. In the Keithing on the slide, there was a fire in the 1820s, and only the beautiful 14th century tower was kept from the medieval church. Something similar happened in Dundee. This is St Mary's Church, where you have this huge 15th century tower attached to a largely 19th century church. So across Scotland, parish churches were entirely demolished or largely rebuilt. Mainly, it seems, because the Church of Scotland and local sort of landowners who would contribute to these projects finally had enough money to make large-scale changes. And now we're sort of in the midst of another period of change. Since the 1960s, falling attendance and denominational mergers have led to churches across Scotland becoming surplus to requirements. Some of these have been converted into venues, and this is a good example, the Drill Hall in Anstruther, sort of community centre and venue. Quite a lot of others have been converted into residential uses. That's church in East Weems in the middle of the slide here, converted, I think, in the 1970s, if I remember rightly. And a few have been abandoned entirely. But these churches, particularly those in the central belt of Scotland, are in a lot of demand for residential conversion. So those of you that undertake research on a local church or have already done so are likely to find that its built history roughly follows that pattern I've just laid out for you. The earliest evidence of a stone structure, sometime in the 12th or maybe the 13th century, significant expansion and augmentation in the 14th or 15th centuries, and then either complete abandonment or major rebuilding taking place in the late 18th or early 19th centuries, and then perhaps more recently, questions over the status of these churches with these mergers between denominations. So if you're interested in exploring the history of your local church, or of any in Scotland for that matter, where do you start? Well, as I showed you with that bibliography on Dysart earlier, undertaking research on parish churches in Scotland is not necessarily easy, but it is quite enjoyable. It involves working with lots of different source types, from documentary materials to visual sources and archaeology, and one of my favourites, which are antiquarian sources. So what I'll do now is give you some general tips for getting started, and then move on to the types of source materials available for different periods, where you can find them and what you might find in them. Now, when you're doing any sort of academic publishing or even essays at university, when you lay out your sources in a bibliography, you start with your manuscripts, then you include your edited primary sources, then your secondary sources, and you finish with any online materials. That is a sort of level of prestige accorded to all the different source types. Now, there's a slight irony, in fact, that actually when doing research, you normally do it the other way round. So rather than plunging straight into the archives and looking at Kirk Session records, the first thing to do is find out what has been done before. So there are a number of good online databases that include decent descriptions of parish churches. And here's just a couple of the best ones. And I am slightly saying that because I worked on those projects, but they are quite good. So we have the Corpus of Scottish Medieval Parish Churches on the top of the slide there. That includes all the churches, mostly in East and Central Scotland. And then we have the Sacred Landscapes of Fife project, which obviously is limited to Fife. So these are good university-run databases with lots of nice pictures and good descriptions of these churches. Quite a number of them also have guides or pamphlets on their history that have been digitized or published in some form or other, or there might be small books on them published. So have a look at local library catalogues, have a look at the National Library of Scotland online and see what you can find. Here's a couple really good examples on churches in Linlithgow, Dundee. The larger churches tend to have had lots of publications on them, perhaps more than the smaller ones, as you'd imagine. And the next step is to find a good local history. So local history publications vary quite a lot from place to place, but there's some really good ones out there. So Stevenson's book on Anstruther, for example, I've included here because it's an example of very good local history. So these are the places to start to find out information on any particular church that you're interested in researching. And what these will allow you to do is start to build a timeline of key dates, periods, and people associated with your church. They'll also help you to put together a list of sources you might want to consult in future, and they might start to identify any anomalies or issues that you might want to investigate further. So do these different sources have different dates for churches? Do they include disagreements over information? So for Dysart, for example, William Muir, writing in the 19th century, suggested that the altar of St Anne wasn't located in the parish church, that it was in a nearby chapel. And that disagreed with some other information. So you can start to identify something that you might want to do some more research upon. The problem with relying entirely on those sort of source materials like those ones is that local histories in particular are not always correct. What often happens in particular with online sources is that certain pieces of information will be repeated from one source to another. And therefore any mistakes or errors can get passed down through the generations. So the next stage of research is to move on from those broader secondary sources to look at some really useful reference sources that exist for this subject. So for the Middle Ages, first place to go are the works of Ian Cowan and Derek Easton. They put together nicely indexed volumes with short summaries of information on all of Scotland's medieval churches. So there's one on parish churches, as you can see at the top, and there's another on mostly on monasteries and other types of churches along those lines. Anyone looking at Fife can access the place names of Fife volumes put together by Simon Taylor and Gilbert Marcus. They're really useful guides. They've got lots of stuff on parish boundaries, key dates, early references to churches. They've also published a volume on the island of Bute, and I think currently are in the process of working on Perthshire. So they're sort of working their way through the country, but it's quite a long process. Once you get into the 16th century, the place to start is John Kirk's book, the Book of Assumption of the Thirds of Benefices. So that work includes a survey that was carried out in the mid 16th century by the Protestants to explore the property of the church. There's lots of interesting financial information in there in particular. And I would also recommend the Building of Scotland series. Here's just one example on the slide here. Sorry, it's a bit blurred. These are mostly published in the 1970s and 80s, and they've got nice short guides to all the historic buildings in different districts of Scotland. And they've got useful things like dates, names, the sort of key background information on them. So this is the sort of thing that you might find out in these reference sources. So this is what you would find if you were looking at these reference sources for Dyser. You'd find out about that it was a mother church of churches at Wemyss and Coddy by about 1100, that it was a free parsonage until 1477, which means it wasn't appropriated to another institution. And after that was in the possession of the Collegiate Church of St Mary's and St Andrews. You'd find out that Reformation church tithes were worth £26 a year, and that a vicar was paid to minister to the population from the tithes. You'd find out that there was a chapel of St James inside the church, and details about what happened in 1802, 1803 when the church was abandoned. So this gives you firm dates on what's going on. But also, more importantly, what you find in these reference works are footnotes and bibliographies that will point you towards where their information comes from. So that will take you to the next stage of your research. And you can contrast this with your what you found in the first stage of research, and hopefully by this point you'll be a little clearer on things like key dates and timeframes. So with these early stages of research, you're likely to have built up a nice long list of the sorts of primary sources that you might want to consult about your church. So the next stage is to check where you can find these and maybe add to the list as well. So if you're researching the period before 1500, the Middle Ages, you're unlikely to look directly at the manuscripts for that period. The relatively thin materials from that era have been compiled, edited, and often translated from the original Latin or Scots by around 150 years worth of different historians and antiquarians. And quite a few of these sources have been included on nice free-to-access websites like these ones. So we have the People of Medieval Scotland website, which has all the charters from late 11th up to 14th century Scotland included on it and translated for you. The dedications to saints in medieval Scotland database has a searchable database which you could put in Dysart, for example, and you can find all the records of dedications to different saints in that parish in the Middle Ages. And if you want to look at them yourself, the collections of clubs like Bannatyne, Maitland Club, Spalding Club, Scottish Record Society, that's where you'll find most of the edited and printed versions of records from the Middle Ages. And the National Library of Scotland is starting to digitise most of these, so you can access these from anywhere. And most large libraries have a pretty good run of these source materials. And some are available sort of semi-legally online as well. Anything that's out of copyright can normally be found on websites like archives.net. Once you get up into the early modern period, sort of 1500 to 1800, there are a lot more sources in general, but digitisation has been a bit less extensive. So there are some useful databases. So the Records of the Parliament of Scotland database has all the parliamentary records up to 1707 on it, and there's quite a lot of stuff on churches in there. So that's quite useful if you're interested in witch hunting and witchcraft located to churches, and Scottish witchcraft database is a place to go. For other key sources from the period, again, it's those clubs, Bannatyne, Maitland, etc., that have all the information. So all the records from the General Assembly, from those synods and presbyteries that I mentioned, even the odd Kirk Session record has been compiled and edited and made available in generally more readable English than that used at the time. So these are quite easily accessible. Once you get up into the 18th century, one of my favourite source materials are the statistical accounts, and I'm sure probably quite a few of you on here are familiar with those. Now, both the first statistical accounts and the second, so the first ones from the 1790s and the second from the 1830s and 40s, both these have been scanned and are searchable online. There's a big website dedicated to it. And they were written almost exclusively by local ministers and provide a fascinating snapshot of the contemporary state of affairs with lots of snippets of information. So here, this is Dysart again here. So here we have the two ministers from 1790 and 1836. So we have George Muirhead in 1791 complaining about his old church. It's dark, the side walls are low, it's difficult to make his voice reach across it. And he even blames his church for the fact that people don't attend. So he suggests that people take advantage of the situation in order to avoid attending church at all. By 1836, of course, the congregation, as we saw, had moved. They built a fancy new church in 1802, 1803, and David Murray in 1836 was a bit nostalgic. It's he that uses that phrase, splendid and venerable building, and he has a clear interest here. And what we are seeing here is general change in society resulting from the works of people like Walter Scott in the early 19th century. There had been this revival of interest in the past, and particularly in the medieval past in the early 19th century. And you often find, if you compare what the ministers had to say about the church in the 1790s and the 1840s, they have a very different attitude to the sort of history of the buildings. Unfortunately, very often, as was the case with Dysart, in between those two dates, much of the medieval fabric of these buildings had been lost as they were rebuilt or completely demolished. And if you're looking for more interesting contemporary material from the 18th and 19th centuries, I would suggest delving into the rich antiquarian sources that survive from Scotland. So from about 1700, a tradition of local history and travel writing has left us with fascinating contemporary accounts of what was happening in all sorts of different places in Scotland, as well as recording local traditions and sometimes sketches of structures and landscapes that have since been lost. Now, unusually, there's not a lot from Dysart in this case, but here's a couple of examples from further up the coast at Anstruther. So in 1869, the local MP retired and wrote a local history book. That was quite common. He noted that there was a coffin in the churchyard that a local tradition suggested was half the coffin of Bishop Adrian, or who had been killed by Vikings on the Isle of May in the distant past. The other half of the coffin could be found on the Isle of May itself. And there was this local legend that the other half, the stone half that was found in the churchyard of West Anstruther, had floated across the Forth. And another local antiquarian, George Taylor, has left us with this lovely sketch of Anstruther Wester in the 1840s, and you can really get a sense of how the church there dominated the local landscape. So these local antiquarian and travel writing works are full of fascinating snippets of information, and occasionally you get a nice picture, something like this as well. It's really good. So in my work, I do a lot of work in community history projects. And that means working with local volunteers sometimes, and often with non-historians, particularly archaeologists. And I tend to come across a very common misconception that all historians do is spend time hanging about in archives, leafing their way through parchments of various types. But as I've suggested already this evening, actually most of what a historian does, particularly a historian of the Middle Ages or early modern Scotland, most of what we do is work our way through secondary sources and printed primary sources. Delving straight into manuscripts without a clear idea of what you're doing is not a particularly sensible practice, and it generally results in a lot of wasted time. However, it is in the rarely used archival records that you're likely to find new information. So if you're interested in witch hunting, in social practice, in precise details about changes to the fabric and personnel of a particular church, it's likely to be in the manuscript sources that you will find this. And you'll find things that have not been included in printed sources for various reasons. So there's quite a good chance that if you've got to a couple stages in your research, that you'll have found lots of references to things like presbytery or Kirk Session records in those earlier databases and things that I pointed you towards. So make sure that if you do find this, that you write down exactly where they come from. You particularly need to note down dates and folios. That's going to save you a lot of time further down the line. Now, thankfully, most modern archives have excellent and easy to use catalogues. National Records of Scotland online catalogue is particularly good because you can search it very easily. Very often you find all the information you need actually from the catalogue, and you don't need to go and look at the actual manuscript. So probably the most relevant manuscript sources that you're likely to find for looking at local churches are those that I looked at, that I showed you earlier. I'll go back to that bibliography. So what did we have for Dysart? We had some Kirk Session records, presbytery records, one or two wills and testaments, that type of thing. Now, presbytery records are particularly useful. Let's see if I get back to the correct place. In the presbytery records, you find the minutes of visitations to churches by the regional authorities. So here's just one example, again from Dysart here. This is fairly prosaic. So we get a visitation from 1636, where they found that the minister was fine, but there were a few problems with the fabric of the church in particular, and they went about dealing with that. So you can find a lot of information about the church buildings in these sorts of visitation records, so it's particularly handy. Rather more dramatic event took place in Anstruther in 1645. In that year, the church was visited by the presbytery of St Andrews, and the elder of the church took the opportunity to unleash a torrent of complaints about the minister, George Dewar. The senior elder, John Thompson, noted that the minister kept too many companions, a view reinforced by William Strang, who stated that the minister's conversation was not suitable because he was a drunkard. According to Strang, the minister used obscene language, he was a false swearer, and it was frequently found in the tavern. Another elder, Thomas Richardson, noted that the minister does keep too much company, while James Scott declared that the minister was a good fellow, but he had heard of his drunkenness. And all the rest of the elders agreed that the minister was far too given to company. Now, Dewar admitted to occasional drunkenness, but objected to any of the other charges and asked that the Kirk Session, the presbytery, not to take this any further. However, the presbytery removed him from his position. So while archival materials like Kirk Session records, like presbytery records, are quite challenging to deal with and often to read, and you can just get a bit of a sense of that from the one I put on the slide here, they do include wonderful little stories about life in 16th, 17th and 18th centuries that you're unlikely to find elsewhere in the printed record. And help with reading these types of sources can be found by the National Records of Scotland website, which has really good online tutorials, and paleography courses are run by most major archives and libraries. And those volunteers I've worked with on community history projects have done lots of these types of courses, and they absolutely love them. There's such a sense of achievement when you're translating a 17th century Kirk Session record or a borough record or something like that. It's like learning a language, the same sort of sense of satisfaction. So just to wrap up, that has been very much a whistle-stop tour through both the history of Scotland's parish churches and where you can find out more about them. Now, while they're not the most glamorous part of Scotland's religious past, they are a vital part of its ecclesiastical heritage, and often, as a minister of Dysart, David Murray, stated in 1836, splendid and venerable buildings. But if you were to take a quick glance, as I did a few weeks ago, at the Church of Scotland website, this tells us that we are currently in quite an important moment where local communities, where planners and other stakeholders are making choices that will have fundamental impacts on Scotland's religious fabric. And that's why learning more about these buildings while we still have them is so important. So thank you for listening. I'll pass back to Jessica for any questions you may have.